Hello, and welcome to the 11th in this series of short films about foundational concepts in economics. What we're going to look at here is one of the central questions of much economic argument and debate, but one where I think there's a great lack of clarity in a lot of the popular discussion, and even until recently in much of the professional economic discussion. That is the question and concept of economic growth. What is economic growth, and where does it come from? Now, the first question seems a very simple and straightforward one. What is economic growth? Well, basically it means more stuff. If at the start of a year you add up the value of all of the goods and services that a given part of the world produces, and you find that it is value X, and then at the end of that year, you add up the value of all the goods and services produced in that year in that same place, and you find out that it's X plus Y, then you would say that the economy has grown by Y. Y is the amount of extra stuff, extra value that the economy has created in that given period of time. So that sounds very straightforward. And in one sense, yes, this is indeed what economic growth is. It really is more stuff. But there are a number of problems with this. The first one, which a lot of people have been writing about recently, is that of how you measure this economic growth. The model I just gave implicitly used the measure known as gross domestic product. Gross domestic product, however, does have problems as a measurement, as many economists have pointed out. It only captures the value of goods that acquire a price through being part of an exchange, through being bought and sold. So to the extent that there is activity going on that produces value, but is not actually the result or part of an exchange, then it's not going to show up in GDP. This is true for most domestic work. So keeping your house clean, housework, looking after children in many cases, all that kind of stuff, cooking meals, making your garden nice, none of that will be captured in GDP. Also, GDP captures work or production, which you might argue is not welfare enhancing, such as activity that causes significant negative externalities, for example. And so there are problems with how you calculate economic growth. However, that doesn't affect the question of what economic growth actually is. It's just that we may have problems working out how much of it there is. And I have to say that although GDP does have these problems, it's still the best measure we have. It's a big challenge for economists to work out what alternative there might be to GDP as a way of establishing what amount of wealth or goods are being produced. The real challenge, though, is that there are actually two quite different kinds of economic growth. And it is very important to distinguish between them and to realize what the difference is. The first kind of economic growth is extensive growth. This is the kind of growth that we find for most of human history in most times and places. Extensive growth means doing more with more. It means getting more output for more input. You work longer hours, you invest more capital, you maybe put more land under the plough. What you do is you use more of one or all of the three key factors of production: land, labor, and capital. And not surprisingly, you should get more output. The point with extensive growth is that there's no increase in productivity because you're simply putting more in to get more out. And so the productivity per unit of land, labor, or capital has not changed. What this means is that extensive growth does not bring about a rise in living standards. Now, the other kind of economic growth, which is rare historically, but the dominant kind in the modern world, is intensive growth. This is caused by or involves productivity growth. And so it leads to not just more stuff, but crucially, more stuff per capita or more value per capita. And this means, therefore, a higher standard of living. It also means a reduced cost of production. The increased productivity of intensive growth means that you need actually less time of labor, less capital or less land to produce a given output. In other words, whereas extensive growth means getting more for more, intensive growth means actually getting more output for less or the same input, because you're using those resources, land, labor, and capital, more intensively. What that means in terms of the lower cost of production is that you have to give up less of your time or other stuff to get the same amount of output or goods. So one of the features of modern growth is the amount of time you have to work to get a product is steadily going down. And this is true even if things like money wages remain flat. Now, there is again a problem here of measurement. When you see statistics about productivity in most of the literature, what they're actually talking about is the productivity of labor. In other words, the amount of output that you get per head of labor, or more commonly, per hour of work done. And so typically what you're getting here when you see productivity statistics is labor productivity. That's because labor productivity is the easiest to measure. It's much more easy to measure than capital or land productivity. However, what you're really interested in, if you're thinking about economic growth, is something called total factor productivity, which is the productivity of all of the three factors of production taken together. Now, this is actually a residual. If you look at an increase in the amount or value of stuff produced over a given time, and you work out how much is due to extra productivity of capital, labor, or land, and take that all away from the amount of extra output, there will be a certain amount left over, a residual. This is total factor productivity, and it's produced by innovation. It is innovation that is the key, therefore, to intensive growth, because it's innovation that leads to the more intensive use of all of the factors of production. It's very easy to be deceived. You may think that one factor of production has become much, much more productive, but it may be that total factor productivity has hardly gone up at all. In the famous example, the advent of the computer meant that offices could employ far fewer staff because they no longer needed literally hundreds or thousands of typists to type up documents and records. They could do it with far few staff. However, when you would put in the cost of the making of the computer and the maintaining of the computer facilities once they are created, you realize that actually in terms of the total factors of production, there'd hardly been any productivity at all. What had happened was that capital labor had become much more productive, but capital and other inputs had increased. So total factor productivity is a very crucial measurement. Now, what this means is that real economic growth, you might say, modern economic growth, intensive economic growth, is caused by innovation. Now, what then causes innovation? Now, the sort of ultimate source of innovation is human ingenuity and inventiveness. But the point is that that's a constant. Human beings are inventive at the same rate throughout human history because human nature has not changed. Our ancestors were just as smart and inventive as we are, but they didn't have as much intensive growth as we do. So something else explains this. Most economists think that the key extra element is institutions. If you have the right institutions, the right laws, the right kind of economic institutions such as property rights, the rule of law, then you will have greater play for human ingenuity and inventiveness, and you will get intensive growth. Not all economists take this view, though. There are some, most notably Deirdre McCloskey, well-known economic historian, who argues that institutions are a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one for economic growth. In other words, if you don't have the right institutions, you won't have economic growth. But even if you do have them, that's not enough by itself to have economic growth. They are a necessary condition for economic growth, but not a sufficient condition. The other condition that you have to have for her and a number of other economists is culture and ideas, in particular, culture and ideas that value and reward entrepreneurship and innovation. This is what you might call also the Schumpeterian view, in which it's not just institutions, it's crucially entrepreneurs, understood in the Schumpeterian sense, who are the source of growth. Historically, economists have had many explanations for why growth happens. Adam Smith thought it was the extent of the market. Others have thought it's produced by capital formation and accumulation. But increasingly, economists all over the world think that the key to economic growth, real economic growth, is innovation. And that ultimately comes down to entrepreneurship and the institutions within which those entrepreneurs act.